Luke 22 presents a number of things that we read rather rapidly when we read the chapter, and it covers all the way from verse 1, where there's the preparation for the Passover, all the way through verse 71, where Jesus is in one of his trials. So this is what Paul refers to in 1 Corinthians as the night in which Jesus was betrayed. The night in which Jesus was betrayed covers from Thursday in the preparation for the Passover on the 14th of Nisan, which we never ever talk about, which is fine. It's related to the Passover. They're going to celebrate the Passover together. Jesus is excited. We find in verses 14 through 23, he gives them information that kind of connects dots from things he's said all through the Gospel of Luke, anticipating, in a sense, this moment with them in which we find that he institutes the Lord's Supper for the very first time, because it hasn't existed up to this point. There's a discussion that Luke brings in verses 24 through 38, actually two discussions. One deals with the greater, who's the greater among us, and we put that into its appropriate place. Again, reminding you that Luke doesn't go point 1 at 9 o'clock, point 2 at 10 o'clock, point 3 at 11 o'clock. Luke will sometimes take an event and, in a sense, turn it on its ear, so that what we find with the discussion on who's the greater would have happened at the beginning, where Jesus has donned the role of servant, bent down and washed the disciples' feet. Because, in essence, I feel that Luke tells us in verse 24 and following, who's the greater? And Peter and John probably would have said, well, we got this all set up, so we're not washing you guys' feet as well. And so it went, and Jesus is the one that says, hey, look it, I'm serving you. After that, Jesus relates to Simon in verse 31 that Satan wants to sift him, but Jesus has prayed for him. And then Peter responds and says, verse 33, Lord, with you I'm ready to go both to prison as well as to death. And Jesus then relates to them, which is next week's sermon, in verse 34, I tell you, Peter, the cock will not crow today until you have denied me 3 times, that you knew me or ever knew me. And so that's coming up next week. Verses 35 to 38, I'm not going to preach that again, except to say that in that Jesus is saying everything's going to be turned upside down. Ministry is going to be different than it was with me. So make sure you, if you don't have a sword, buy one. And the boys still, they don't get a lot of what Jesus is saying most of the time. And in verse 38 they say, hey, there's 2 swords here. And Jesus says, it looks like 2 is enough. It looks like, because that's what he says. That's not it. He says, in essence, we're done here. And I only allude to that because of where we are going in today's passage in verse 47 and following, where a sword appears. 39 through 46, if you put all 4 of the Gospels together, you have a time of prayer. 8 of them over there, 3 of them here, and Jesus here. They're separated out. And Jesus prays, comes back, wakes them up, prays, comes back, wakes them up, prays, comes back, and basically says in verse 46, why are you sleeping? Rise and pray that you may not enter into temptation. That's where Luke leaves us before we pick up with today's passage in verse 47, while he was still speaking. Now, we read it now, you read it on your own, but what Luke does in an amazing fashion is he gives us a movie This is a movie. There's actors moving. There's people speaking at certain times. There's, I forget all the phraseology of acting, but there's places, marks, where people are supposed to be at a certain time and they say this and then this person responds. That's what we're going to see here. Luke does an amazingly brilliant job of sharing this with us. While he was yet speaking. All four Gospels tell us that. So what you want to image here is a dark garden, and Jesus is speaking. The boys, in essence, are just waking up again because everybody's tired. And Luke tells us in the previous portion, they're sleeping because of sorrow. And it's not sorrow for, in a sense it is for what's going to happen, because Jesus has just told them that one of you is going to betray me. Now, you don't think that would throw a little bit of a monkey wrench into the gears of their well-oiled ministry machine? Yeah, they were really, really sad, torn up. They don't know who it is. So with weariness, then, they all fall asleep. Jesus comes back for the third time, and while he's telling them to wake up and pray in order that they would not fall into temptation, there's something going on behind Jesus. Luke says very succinctly, behold, a crowd. Crowd, oxalos in the Greek, is also a multitude. Crowd, I don't know, in my mind anyway, a crowd is this big and a multitude is this big. So pick your word, whatever you like, but it's the same thing. A crowd, a multitude. Luke says, while Jesus was speaking, look, a multitude. And what Luke tells us here is the one being called Judas, one of the 12, not the 8, not the 3. He was the one that was missing. Where was he? No one knew. Now they know. He's right there. And he, the one being called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them, was going before them. He was in front of this crowd. Now, let me, I was writing down some notes on my notes, and I said, these are the concluding moments of voluntary freedom and ministry. They're coming to a close. What kind of temptation might the disciples, I refer to verse 46, be facing? We will see that in verse 49 in just a few moments. They're protecting a physical kingdom, but we'll get there. Now, Luke, in this writing, identifies the traitor as leading the pack out of the darkness. And anybody who's seen anything at night in the dark and somebody's coming now with a flashlight, we don't usually, hold torches. But torches, flashlights, they will have an impact on the trees, on the shadows. So what I put here for myself was, out of the darkness comes a night terror. Now stop and think about that. Some of you have woken up in the middle of the night to a noise. And it's not the clock ticking. And it's not your spouse snoring. It's a different noise. What happens to you? Keep in mind, the 11 are just waking up again. Jesus is in command, in control. He's just been ministered to by angels. We found that in the previous section. And now, as they're listening to Jesus, while he's still speaking, the shadows, the lights, back and forth, the movement through the brush, through the garden of literally hundreds. Not 20, not 30, not 40, not 50, not 75, not 100. About 200 people. And in front of this pack is the one we refer to as the traitor. The one being called Judas. He was in front. Now, Luke, before we finish verse 47, says something that is unusual. It made me stop. He says in two aorist tense, remember aorists are punctiliar, they're a point in time, they're a bit of history that happens here. It's not a progressive word, it's not a continuous word, it just happened. He approached, he came near to Jesus to kiss him. Now, kissing, growing up, I was always kind of rolling my eyes at this type of thing in the, Paul especially, greet one another with a holy kiss. And I'm always thinking, that's my mother's friend. I'm not going to be kissing Iva. Yeah. No, it's not the same. It's the kissing on the cheek. But in a sense, apart from the concept of romance, it is the same. Because it's a friendship. It's a familial type of relationship. It's an acceptance. It's a proximity thing, right? I mean, I can do this morning. That's not proximity, is it? You kiss by being very close. So what is the imagery here that Luke is giving us? The pack leader, Judas, how important he must have felt, walks up to the culprit, the reason that 200 plus guys are there, walks up with the intent of kissing Jesus, because we know that the sign he gave was, whoever you see me kiss, he's the one. Get him. So Luke tells us that Judas drew near to kiss. Now, I wondered, because there's four relations of the garden experience, and all of them are the same and different. Luke is the shortest. Luke tends to take this much and bring it down to this. That's why the way he writes things, which is different than the other synoptics, Matthew and Mark, and different than John's, who expand so much on certain portions, he gives us these imageries, and apparently he doesn't think much of Judas. Because Judas drew near, intimacy, to the master to kiss him, because that was the sign that he gave. The others tell us that he actually kissed him. So it's interesting because I cannot determine, based upon the tenses of the Greek, in verse 48, now Jesus said to him, and this is the way it reads in the Greek, you need to catch the emphasis, Judas, with a kiss, the Son of Man, do you deliver over, betray, give up. That's what the word is. We bring into the concept of betrayal, because the purpose of Judas's activity is to turn this one, Jesus, over to them. So to deliver up, the word betrayal works just fine. But Jesus talks to him. Jesus talks to him. Now there's a couple things here. You've heard the phrase, it's not personal, it's business. Yeah, you've just been squished out of, $8,000 that, It's not personal. Seriously? Judas has business to attend to. He's contracted. He's agreed to betray Jesus with a kiss for 30 pieces of silver. It's not personal, Jesus. Really? But it's very personal with Jesus. So whether you say that Judas is here about to kiss, or whether Judas just kissed him, and backed away? I don't know, but this is what Jesus does. Jesus says, Judas, with a kiss, the Son of Man, do you give up? Do you deliver over? Do you betray? So Jesus speaks his name. There is no question on who he's talking to. He asks him a cutting question. The most intimate thing that we can do as friends is to kiss on the cheek. But guess what? The betrayal now has taken place. And guess what? For Judas, it is now too late. I've mentioned in the past, over this past week, from the triumphal entry through this point, that Jesus' grace has been extended again and again. At the Last Supper, Jesus' grace was extended again and again to Judas. Judas could have stopped at any point. Judas could have stopped and misled them out of the city of Jerusalem and gone all the way to Bethany. But he didn't. He came to the garden. And Judas, when he saw Jesus standing there and the 11 behind him, could have said, shoot, he's not here. But he didn't. He chose to walk up, kiss Jesus, and when Jesus said this, with a kiss, the Son of Man, do you betray? It was done. And now it was too late for Judas. I sat there and contemplated that. And because Kathy and I converse about our unsaved friends as we pray for them and various ones we know who were somewhere in, quote unquote, the church. And now today they're over there, outside of all relationship, connection with God. And it's like God's grace is continually extended, continually. And yet at one point, it may be too late. Now we look at verse 49, and those around Jesus, and that's literally the 11, those around Jesus, and I love the way that Luke says, seeing what is to be happening. I mean, how many times have you seen either someone or your pet? You know, you see where they're looking and you see a car coming and you can see what's going to happen. And so you either call their name or get the lasso or you run out, whatever. You do something to prevent what is about to happen. It doesn't take rocket science to figure this out. And so the boys are standing there, the 11 disciples are standing there behind Jesus, and they are literally seeing that which would be happening. Judas is here, 200 armed men with torches and clubs and swords are there. Jesus is here, they're here, and they can see what's happening. So this is that moment in time when they say, Lord, shall we smite with the sword? And literally it's the sword. They have one sword. I believe that personally that none of them had swords, that Peter borrowed the one of the two that was mentioned in the previous portion that was on the wall in the house of the upper room. He had that with him. And the question is, shall we strike with the sword? Now, what gives them the courage? I mean, just we're 30 people? And there's 200 thugs outside that want to beat us all up and take our wedding rings and our wallets. Literally, what chance do we have? One of you has a pocket knife. Okay? You get the concept, 11 to 200. We've got a sword. What gives them the quote-unquote courage to ask this question? Shall we strike with a sword? I believe that it's from the John passage, John 18? John 18, verse 6, in which when Jesus said, who are you guys seeking? We're seeking Jesus of Nazareth. Well, I am he. John tells us that they all fell down. And I've just been amazed at the power. All Jesus had to say was, I am he. And they all fell down. They all fell down. So stop and think. We walk out, there's 200 thugs out here who want to steal your glasses and your wedding rings and your wallets, and they're all on the ground. It's like, hey Wayne, is it time to stomp them? Cut off their belts with my jackknife? There, I've got his belt. What would give the guys that kind of courage? If everybody was on the ground, except for them and Jesus. I believe that was the impetus for this word, for this question. Well, obviously, even according to John, they get back up. Jesus asks the second time, who are you seeking? Jesus of Nazareth. I am he. Let these guys go. And so at one point, they come up and they bind Jesus. And as this is happening, and because Jesus didn't say yes or no, Peter, the brain of the outfit, takes the sword and he's going to wreak havoc. That's what Peter does. He's good. So he takes the sword and he aims at this guy right here. We find that his name is Malchus. He is the servant of the high priest. And I've thought a lot about what in the world is he doing there. But anyway, so Peter aims to whack him in two, and the guy must have dodged because he got his ear. Now the actual term is cut off. Cut off his ear. When it gets down to it, some of you have had accidents. Hopefully you have all 10 digits, but some of you have accidents in which one of the phalanges is hanging on more or less by skin. And that's what I see, the ear. And I checked, because my whole life I've always thought the ear fell on the ground, Jesus picks it up, blows it off, and puts it back on. But I don't think that's the imagery that we are supposed to get. By the way, verse 50, and a certain one of them smote the slave of the high priest and took off his ear, his right ear, by the way. No one says Peter. That is to say, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So we find it was Peter later. So, verse 51. Our translations all say, but Jesus answered, or answering. Well, that particular word is to answer, to respond, rather, to a certain present circumstance. In other words, Jesus responded. He's answering what? Is he answering the question from verse 49? Is it time to strike? And so Jesus answering that? I don't think so. I think the word answering is responding to the situation that is here. As Jesus stands now, cuffed, Peter steps forward, takes a swing and a miss, so to speak. Jesus responds, and I'm sure it was like that. And if you look at the various translations, they interpret it as that, and you can do it that way, that Jesus is talking to the disciples. Permit this far, suffer ye thus far. Stop, no more of this. The verbiage in the Greek is a little frustrating. But Jesus says, allow or permit. And then I think he stops, and up to this. And so I did this. I don't think it could be that, because I think he is in the process of being tied. So having touched the ear, he healed it. It's one phrase. So that's why I don't think he bent down, picked up, blew off, and did this. I think he literally, the guy is standing there like this, ha, ha, and Jesus does this, touches the ear, and it's as good as new. Yep, good as new. It all works. I can hear you. So I believe that when Jesus says this is suffer this far, allow this much, because you understand this is a pivotal, hostile moment. Those 200 plus guys behind with clubs and swords are not there to play Yahtzee. And you know what happens. We don't have any of our policemen with us this morning, but you know what happens when the police officer says hands in the air and somebody reaches in like this. What are they going to pull out? A chiclets? They don't know. It's a dangerous situation is what I'm saying. And it can escalate out of control like that. So what is Jesus doing? Jesus is putting a kibosh on the whole thing. On the 200, permit this far. Malchus is going, not even any blood. Having touched the ear, Jesus healed him. Now, we get something very interesting. Because in the other accounts, we find that the ones that were sent from the Sanhedrin, were sent from the high priests. But here, if you see in verse 52, then Jesus said, to who? To the chief priests and the officers of the temple and elders. Who are the elders? They're part of the Sanhedrin. Who are the officers of the temple? Well, they're the temple police. You don't go around misbehaving in the temple. You just don't. The officers will take you out and show you what you ought not to do. The chief priests, now some have said that this is impossible, they would never do that. Oh, really? Have you not read the previous 21 chapters of Luke on what these guys want to do to Jesus? Almost from the get-go, all the way at the River Jordan, where they're hassling John the Baptist, and then Jesus is baptized. And then what happened when he went back to his hometown in Nazareth? He was in the synagogue. He said something, and they did what? They pushed him up the hill in order to what? Throw him off. And that wasn't even the people in charge. It did nothing but escalate over his 3 years of ministry. So by the time he gets in Jerusalem, we already know that they have done nothing but want to off this guy. So, you don't think that now that they've got their patsy in a guy named Judas, one of the inner circle with Jesus, he's taken them out, that some of them aren't curious enough to see the fruit of their vicious, malicious labor? Curiosity. So, with this group, and I say 200 plus, you stop and go back over the previous, not just week, but even before that, but just go back to the previous days in this particular week with the cleansing of the temple and so on and so forth, where they even wanted to kill Lazarus the one Jesus raised from the dead. They even wanted to kill him because people were looking at Lazarus and say, he was dead? Yeah. He doesn't look dead. No, he's not. That's because he's not. He's alive. How did he get there? Jesus raised him from the dead. Jesus? Yeah. Oh, maybe he's the Messiah. So that vitriol is playing out. It's here, and Jesus is now responding. He says to them, as against a robber, not an insurrectionist, a simple thief. It's the same word, if you remember the Good Samaritan story, that he was beaten up by thieves. The same guy. Not insurrectionists, no, not the Barabbases, but simple robber. As against a robber did you come out with short swords and clubs? Luke doesn't tell us these were Romans and Jews, but the short swords are Romans and the clubs are the Jews, the temple police. They use clubs. The swords belong to the Romans. So this is an admixture, an ad hoc group. Jews and Gentiles come together at the behest of the Jews to do this onus thing. So Jesus was in the temple teaching every day, and he asks this cutting question. It's a question of truth. Truth ultimately wins out. I mean, you can poo-poo the truth, you can throw it out. We've seen that almost on a daily basis if you pay attention to what anybody says that's a world leader, and you go, whatever. But he says, day by day, I was with you in the temple, and you didn't stretch out a hand against me. You didn't touch me when I was available. It's a slap across the reality of what they're doing. And of course, you know that people always have a response to the truth. It's either like, wow, I wish I had seen that sooner, or I don't care. And in this case, of course, it's I don't care. There's one last thing before we close off today, because we're done with this portion, where Jesus has now confronted them, and this is the leadership. Not all the leadership. I mean, Caiaphas and Annas are not there, but I'm sure there's others who just hated Jesus because Jesus said things about himself that they didn't accept. He closes off with this. But this is your hour and the authority of the darkness. We miss that, typically. But something that Matthew tells us, I wish it was in the Luke account, but it's not, so I have to tell you what he says. Put your sword away. Don't you think I could have asked my Father in heaven and he send 10,000 angels? Try to work that through in your mind in this garden setting. The same kind of almost at the beginning of his ministry, or beginning of his life, with the angels coming down and his with the shepherds. And they give the announcement, born unto you in the city of David and Bethlehem. And can you imagine that happening here in the garden? All these guys would have been nothing but mush on the ground. Do you think Jesus could not have done that? Of course he could have. And we need to know that. We need to know that Jesus at any point could have stopped this whole thing. He could have stopped it all. But he did not, because he had to fulfill his goal, his life, his purpose for even being on earth encased in flesh. He had to fulfill his act, his part in the redemptive story as the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. So we see here that if he had not allowed the darkness, how did I put that? This is a fact. He was right there as easy pickings, but they acted as cowards. And in the temple that week, his time had not yet come. Keep in mind now, this is the Passover, and there's a whole bunch of things that we connect with the Passover that happened with him here. But now the time has come, and this hour is the power of darkness to accomplish what truth and light never could. That is to say, truth and light would always prevent what is happening here, but darkness has taken in order to snuff out the light of the world. So all this culmination, we just celebrated Christmas, the first Advent, the first coming of our Jesus, born as a man, born of a virgin, God, man. And here, he's saying, I could have called 10,000 angels, but this has to be fulfilled. And he's looking at the ones here. I mean, Malchus, the servant of the high priest, whose ear was now, pull that again for me. I just want to make sure. He did a good job. He lived with that his whole life. Did he ever, was his life ever transformed by that? I don't know. But I have a hunch that he could not go through life and say this guy was a thief, a charlatan. But he says to them, this is your hour and the authority, the power of darkness. And so they take him, and next week he begins his trials. We find the betrayal, the denial of Peter, which is fascinating all in and of itself. We see ourselves in him too much. But just to realize what your Jesus did, this movie plays out for us. Let it play out for you. Watch the guys come up behind the boys and Jesus. Watch Jesus in action. Watch him command, put the sword away. I could do this, but I don't, because these guys have their hour, and I will go through it. Pretty amazing picture. Father, we're yours and we're grateful. We wouldn't be yours if it wasn't for this very thing. And our Jesus, whom we have seen from chapter 1 of Luke, with the simple message to Mary that she would bear the Messiah, on up through this moment, and then what we're going to see in the weeks ahead with Jesus' trials, and then his crucifixion, and then his burial, and then his resurrection. Lord, we couldn't do this without you. There would be no this without you. We are redeemed by the blood of the Lamb. And he chose to do this. He chose this path for us. So, may we continue to worship our Jesus this week in various ways, through the various testings and trials that we go through, to the glory of God. Go before us, Lord, in the name of Jesus.